Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I'm going to have to talk about a recent video by Jim Sterling, and why it is a video that really does miss the mark in my opinion, and demonstrates to me just the sort of hypocrite that this man truly is. Now, the particular video in question is his latest Jimquisition, which is simply titled, "Shut Up, Stop Thinking, and Play Video Games Guilt-Free." And given the title of the video and also the fact that it's Jim Sterling we're talking about, it is filled with exactly the sort of patronizing attitude you may have come to expect from him. Now, I've already responded once before in the past on one of Jim Sterling's videos and why he was wrong about politics in video games. However, I do want to make this video much shorter than that previous one. So instead of going through the entire video piece by piece, allow me to instead lay out the core points that he makes here. To put it bluntly, the things that Jim complains about are the scandalous behavior of the AAA industry, the predatory business models that they have adopted, the backlash that journalists such as Jason Schreier have received for pointing these things out, the fact that the vast majority of gamers absolutely despise the idea of forced politics in their video games, and of course bringing all of this up in order to smear gamers who want to play video games as a form of escapism. Now, the first thing I have to point out is that Jim may actually be a little bit behind the times here, because with regards to all the shady things the AAA publishers do, yeah, I'm sure a lot of gamers do absolutely know about this. That said, I would also have to say that, in my opinion, the AAA publishers are becoming increasingly irrelevant in this day and age. Not only due to the fact that AAA publishers release fewer games per year now, but also due to the rise in the indie market. So in all honesty, it looks more and more like the AAA publishers are eventually going to find their way out of the industry altogether. All people really need to do at this point is just buy more indie games and simply ignore the AAA industry. And thanks to the increasingly boring nature of most AAA games, that's become easier and easier to do as time has went on. Maybe it's just me, but I don't really care about most AAA games anymore. The only one I've really had interest in this year has been Doom Eternal, at least if we're not counting remasters. But by comparison, some of the indie games I've been interested in include titles such as Ready or Not, or Mountain Blade Bannerlord, or even Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. But again, maybe that's just me. So if you, dear viewer, happen to have a different take on this, then feel free to let me know in the comments below. But this allows me to move on to the real meat and potatoes of this video, and that is the genuine hypocrisy of Jim Sterling with some of his other points here. For a start, it says plenty that Jim Sterling has decided to defend an individual such as Jason Schreier, claiming that he cares about ethics in the current video game industry and calling out its abuses, while Jason Schreier happens to be actively responsible for some of that abuse himself. For example, some of my longtime viewers will no doubt be familiar with the fact that Jason Schreier is one of the game journalists that tried to smear the good name of Sophia Narwitz, a fellow journalist who had actually uncovered one of the biggest video game scandals in recent history, the fact that the ESA had accidentally doxed all of the attendees of E3 last year. Now, had Jason Schreier actually cared about ethics within the AAA industry, he would have openly supported Miss Sophia Narwitz in her efforts that have ultimately led to the exposure of one of the greatest breaches of security and trust from AAA publishers. But instead, he not only downplayed her efforts, but actively tried to smear and slander her for it. And of course, the topic of ethics within the video game industry brings us quite cleanly to the topic of ethics within video game journalism. And when it comes to games journalism, the simple truth is that Jason Schreier is the Randy Pitchford of the game journalist community, and Gamergate was his Aliens Colonial Marines. His constant lies of what Gamergate actually was throughout his career really does cement the fact that his word is simply not one worth trusting. And this is of course on top of the various scandals that Kotaku has had while Jason Schreier was still there, with some of the articles even covering topics that are so extreme that I can't even link the article here on YouTube. Otherwise I would receive a community guideline strike for it. But basically what I'm saying is I can't really find myself getting worked up over Jason Schreier finally getting a taste of his own medicine. If anything, I'd say it almost feels cathartic. But of course, let's move on to the final 2 points that Jim makes. The fact that he's upset that people don't like forced politics within video games, and also his hostile attitude towards people who just want to play video games. First of all, let's talk about the whole keep your politics out of my video game debate, as once again Jim starts off by incorrectly framing the whole argument. On the one hand, it's not enough to merely say that the people who want forced politics into video games merely view all games as political. And yes, these individuals do seem to think that every single game is political, as demonstrated by the fact that game journalists such as Ben Kuchera will argue that Tetris virus was actually pro-Soviet propaganda. And as I mentioned, as extreme as that example may seem at first, it is still not extreme enough to accurately depict the position that the forced politics crowd actually possess, as they believe that all video games are fundamentally propaganda and should be subverted in order to specifically push pro-Marxist propaganda. And for those of you who think that is an extreme exaggeration of the situation, I would strongly suggest that you read Games of Empire, which is the academic book written by two college professors that actively started this whole debate. And keep in mind, the purpose of this particular book was to quote-unquote educate college students. But as I've said in this whole tangent, the actual position taken by the forced politics crowd is at its core that all games are propaganda and should therefore be subverted to push pro-Marxist propaganda. By contrast, the keep your politics out of video games crowd can be more accurately described as people who understand that there can be political themes within games, but do not want politics forcefully inserted into them where they do not make sense. And there is a very practical reason for this, because forcing politics into video games and turning them into propaganda does a disservice to video games as an art form. This is something that Jim simply seems incapable of comprehending. The fact that he so thoroughly disrespects video games as an art form that he sees them as little more than a tool or resource to be exploited for his own ends, to the extent that he will happily sacrifice the quality of the game in order to better push the message. And when it comes to forced politics, I would say that right now it is actively doing more damage to the video game industry than loot boxes are. And I actually have a few examples to demonstrate this, with the easiest example by far being the fact that Battlefield 5 is the worst game in its entire franchise, despite the fact that it completely did away with the loot box mechanics that were present in some of the more popular games such as Battlefield 4 and Battlefield 1. And of course, one of the big reasons behind this was the forced political message that came in the form of forced diversity, despite the fact that Battlefield 5 was marketed as a historically authentic and immersive World War II game, when in reality it was so unimmersive that a game such as Dino D-Day by comparison could look and feel more like a proper World War II shooter. And that was the World War II game that had dinosaurs in it by comparison. There are other examples of forced politics, of course, making the games industry worse. Just look at The Last of Us Part 2, for example. But I believe I've already made my point. That being that Jim is simply and woefully out of touch with what the games industry truly needs right now. That being a much greater focus on the indie market itself, and into supporting forced politics within video games, actually holding your fellow game journalists to actual ethical standards, and above all else, there needs to be an end to treating gamers with absolute and utter contempt. The fact that I cannot make my mind up on whether or not AAA publishers or game journalists treat gamers worse really speaks loads about how far things have fallen. But to be honest, I don't exactly see Jim holding his fellow journalists to any real standards anytime soon. Instead, I fully expect him to continue wallowing in his own hypocrisy. But either way, it may end up sorting itself out regardless, as the more these people fail to hold themselves accountable, the less people will trust them, and consequently they will go into obscurity slowly and silently. In any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.